You were always a mistake, Waverly, but now you can finally be useful. Sign the consent forms or don't expect to see another dime of your tuition paid. My father, Osric, spat from his hospital bed. His voice was raspy, but his eyes were as cold as ice, even through the haze of his illness. He didn't ask how I was doing. He didn't even look at the colorful get-well card I had placed on his bedside table. He just stared at the legal clipboard like it was the only thing that mattered in the world. My half-brother Torin stood by the window, adjusting his designer watch. He smirked as he walked over and shoved a heavy silver pen into my shaking hand. "It's just a kidney, sis. You have two, and Dad has zero that actually work. Don't be selfish for once in your life," he sneered. He looked at me like I was a piece of equipment that needed a part replaced, not his own sister. I stood there, the sterile hospital air burning my lungs, looking at the family that had treated me like a ghost for 20 years. I realized in that second that they only saw me as a biological backup drive. I started to back away from the bed, the pen slipping from my fingers. I felt a wave of pure, hot hurt wash over me. I had spent my life trying to earn a crumb of their love, and now I knew the price was my own body. As I reached the door, my father's lawyer, Silas, stepped out of the shadows. He leaned in and whispered so only I could hear. "If you don't sign, Waverly, they will use the morality clause in your late mother's trust to seize everything she left you. You'll be homeless by morning." My name is Waverly, and I am the mistake child of the billionaire Sterling Empire. I was born from my father's scandalous second marriage to a woman the family called a nobody. When my mother passed away 10 years ago, Osric took me into the mansion. He didn't do it out of love or duty. He did it to keep the press from calling him a deadbeat father while he was trying to take his company public. I grew up in a house filled with gold and marble, but I was never allowed to feel at home. I was the invisible daughter. While Torin was groomed to take over the empire, I was tucked away in the smallest room in the servants' wing. I wasn't allowed to sit at the grand dining table during official dinners or holiday celebrations. They told me my presence would distract the important guests. I ate my meals alone in the kitchen, listening to the laughter of a family that didn't want me. They thought I was just a quiet, obedient girl who didn't notice the whispers or the glares. But they were wrong. I wasn't just sitting in corners being sad. Since I was 15, I've been secretly recording every family meeting and every argument. I have a hidden folder on an encrypted drive labeled "The Cost of Silence." I've documented every time Osric bragged about fixing the books and every time Torin bragged about handling people who got in his way. They thought I was a ghost, but I was actually the historian of their crimes. I was waiting for a reason to speak, and now they had given me 20. After I fled the hospital, I went to see the transplant coordinator, Dr. Alaric. I needed to know the truth about the procedure. He was a kind man with tired eyes, and he looked at me with a look of deep pity that made my heart ache. "Waverly," he said softly, looking over the files. "I shouldn't be telling you this, but you deserve to know. You weren't actually the first choice for this transplant. There was another match who was even more compatible." I frowned, confused. If there was a better match, why are they hounding me? Dr. Alaric let out a heavy sigh and leaned back in his chair. "Because the other match was Torin. Your half-brother is a perfect biological match for your father. He could have ended this crisis weeks ago." My jaw dropped. Torin had spent the last hour calling me selfish and demanding my organs while he sat on a perfect match himself. "Why didn't he do it?" I asked, my voice trembling with anger. Dr. Alaric looked away, looking disgusted. He told the board he refused to donate because he didn't want a surgical scar to ruin his upcoming summer modeling career for that luxury watch brand. He convinced your father that you were the expendable child, so they decided to force you instead. I felt a coldness settle in my chest. They weren't just asking for help. They were sacrificing me to save Torin's vanity. I woke up the next morning to the sound of my phone buzzing. I expected a call from the hospital, but instead, I saw an email from my university. My heart hammered against my ribs as I read the words. My full-ride scholarship, which was funded by my father's Sterling Charity Foundation, had been revoked effective immediately. The reason given was a change in foundation priorities. I realized then that Osric was already moving to starve me into submission. He was taking away my education to show me who was boss. I didn't panic. I called the university registrar, a woman named Ottilie whom I had helped with some research projects last year. "Ottilie, what happened?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She sounded nervous on the other end. Waverly, I'm so sorry. The foundation pulled the funds this morning. But that's not the worst part. I saw the internal ledger. The money wasn't just pulled, it was redirected to pay for Torrin's new influencer studio in the city. I hung up the phone and sat on the edge of my bed. My father was using my future as a bargaining chip, and my brother was literally building a playground with my tuition money. They thought that without their money, I would crawl back to the hospital and beg to be cut open. They didn't realize that I had been saving every penny of my small allowance for years, and I had enough to survive for a few months. They wanted a war, and they were about to find out I was already armed. A few hours later, my stepmother, Delphine, visited me at my small off-campus apartment. She walked in like she was entering a slum, holding a silk handkerchief to her nose. I thought for a split second that she was there to apologize for the scholarship, but the look on her face was pure venom. "You've made quite a mess, Waverly," she said, packing the small room. "Osric's health is failing, and you're playing games. If you don't save him, I'll personally make sure you never find work in this city. I'll blackball you from every firm we own." She leaned in close, her expensive perfume making me feel nauseous. "Think about your reputation, dear. Who will want to hire the daughter who let her own father die out of spite?" She thought she was being subtle, but I saw the truth. As she adjusted her hair, I noticed she was wearing a vintage diamond necklace. My heart stopped. It was my mother's missing necklace, the one the police said was stolen during a break-in years ago. It was the only thing my mother had wanted me to have. "That's my mother's necklace, Delphine," I said, my voice cold. She didn't even flinch. She just touched the diamonds and smirked. "It was part of the estate settlement. You have no proof of anything." She turned on her heel and walked out, leaving me shaking with a different kind of rage. They had stolen my mother's legacy, my tuition, and now they wanted my health. I realized then that being the bigger person was over. It was time to be the person they should have been afraid of. That evening, as I was sitting in the dark, my phone chimed with a text from an unknown number. I almost deleted it, thinking it was more harassment from Torrin, but the first few words stopped me. "They aren't just taking your kidney, Waverly. They're planning to declare you mentally unfit right after the surgery so they can keep you in a facility and control your mother's remaining trust forever. Don't go to the hospital tomorrow." I felt my blood run cold. My hands were shaking so hard I almost dropped the phone. I replied, asking who it was. A minute later, a second text arrived. "It's Bram. I was your father's bodyguard for 10 years. I was the one who used to bring you extra food when they sent you to your room without dinner. I was fired this morning because I refused to intimidate you into signing the papers. They are dangerous, kid. Run." I remembered Bram. He was the only person in that mansion who ever treated me like a human being. He used to tell me stories about his time in the military while he stood guard at my door. If he was risking his safety to warn me, then the threat was real. Osric and Delphine weren't just looking for a donor. They were looking for a way to erase me permanently so I could never claim my mother's hidden inheritance. I wasn't just fighting for my kidney, I was fighting for my freedom. The next morning, Osric called me himself. His voice was suddenly weak, shaky, and filled with a fake, fatherly love that made my skin crawl. "Waverly, honey." He wheezed into the phone. "I know I've been hard on you. I'm scared and I'm sick. I've realized that family is all that matters. If you do this for me, I'll change everything. I've had Silas draw up a new will. I'm nomming you a co-heir to the entire sterling fortune. You'll have the life you always deserved." He sent over a digital copy of the new will for me to look at. For a second, a tiny part of me wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that he finally saw me. But then I opened the document and looked at the very bottom. The signature line for the legal witness was Lennox Sterling. I stared at the name, a chill running down my spine. Lennox was my grandfather, Osric's father. He had died 3 years ago in a high-profile funeral that the whole city attended. The document was a total fake, a clumsy forgery put together by Silas to trick me into the operating room. My father was so desperate to steal my organ that he was using a dead man's name to lie to me. He didn't love me. He just wanted to use me one last time before discarding me. I didn't reply to the call. I just saved the fake document to my cost of silence folder. I realized that my father's love was just another business transaction, and I was done being sold. By that afternoon, the story hit the tabloids. A headline screamed, "Billionaire's heartless daughter refuses to save dying father." There was a photo of me leaving the hospital looking upset, and a quote from an anonymous family source saying I was demanding $50 million in exchange for the kidney. The comments section was a war zone. People who didn't know me were calling me a monster, a gold digger, and human trash. They were saying I should be forced to give it up. I felt like I was drowning in the hate. I knew exactly who the source was. It was Claribel, Delphine's personal assistant. I had seen her filming me in the hallway with her phone. Silas had clearly paid the tabloids to paint me as the villain so that when they finally handled me, no one would ask questions. They were destroying my reputation to make my disappearance easier. I sat on my floor, clutching my knees, feeling the weight of the entire city judging me for a lie. The pressure was suffocating. My phone was filled with death threats from strangers who thought they were heroes. I realized that I couldn't just stay quiet anymore. If I didn't fight back now, they would win before I even got to court. I reached out to an old contact I had made during my internship, an investigative blogger who hated the Sterlings as much as I did. I told him I had a story to tell, but I needed to prove one thing first. I needed a blood test that didn't come from a Sterling-owned hospital. I went to an independent lab on the other side of town, run by a man named Eamon. He was a retired forensic scientist who didn't care about billionaire names. I paid for a full DNA and compatibility workup out of my savings. 2 days later, Eamon called me back into his office. He looked at the results with a puzzled expression. "Waverly," he said, tapping the paper. "There's something very strange about your father's medical file that he sent over to the registry." He showed me the charts. "You are a match for your father, Osric, that's true. But Osric isn't the only one in the family who has this specific rare kidney condition. It's genetic." He pulled up a second file that he had found in a public medical database. "Your half-brother Torin has the exact same underlying markers. He's not just refusing to donate because of a scar. He's refusing because he's actually in the early stages of the same failure." The twist hit me like a physical blow. Torin was failing too, and the family was keeping it a secret to keep the company's stock from crashing. They were trying to take my kidney to save Osric now, knowing that Torin would need one later. They were planning to harvest me like a crop to keep the true heirs alive. Torin's modeling career was a lie to cover up his own hospital visits. They were treating me like a warehouse of spare parts for their golden bloodline. I decided to show up at a high-end charity auction being held at the Sterling Mansion. Delphine was hosting it, selling off family heirlooms to raise money for kidney research. It was a disgusting publicity stunt. I wore a simple black dress and a mask, blending in with the wealthy crowd. I watched as Delphine auctioned off a locked wooden chest, claiming it contained precious memories. I used a line of credit that I had established using my mother's maiden name, a secret they didn't know I had. I outbid everyone in the room. When the gavel hit, I walked up and took the chest. Delphine looked at me with confusion, not recognizing me behind the mask. I took the chest to a corner and forced the lock. My breath caught in my throat. Inside wasn't jewelry or gold. It was a collection of my mother's private journals. They were filled with her handwriting, detailing exactly how Osric had embezzled her entire inheritance to build his first billion. The journals contained bank account numbers, dates, and names of people Osric had bribed to keep my mother quiet. She had been documenting his crimes for years, planning to leave him before she accidentally got sick. I realized that my mother hadn't just died of natural causes. She had been trapped just like I was. These journals were the key to everything. They proved that the Sterling Empire was built on stolen money. I tucked them under my arm and left the mansion before Delphine could see my face. I knew I needed professional help to stay safe. I used some of the trust fund money to hire Caius, a private investigator who specialized in high-level corporate crime. I showed him the morality clause that Silas was using to threaten me. Caius spent 3 days digging into the legal documents. He called me into his office with a grim look on his face. "Waverly, I found the trigger for that clause," he said. "It only activates if you are convicted of a serious crime." He leaned across his desk, lowering his voice. "My sources tell me that your family is desperate. They've hired a crew to plant illegal substances in your apartment tomorrow night. They want to call the police, get you arrested, and then use the conviction to trigger the clause and force you into a state-mandated surgery. They aren't waiting for you to say yes anymore. They're going to frame you." I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. They were willing to put me in prison just to get into my body. I realized that my father wasn't just a sick man. He was a monster who would rather see his daughter in a cell than admit he was wrong. I looked at Caius and told him we weren't going to let them plant anything. We were going to set a trap of our own. I called Bram and told him the plan. It was time to use their own shadows against them. With Bram's help, I spent the afternoon installing hidden cameras in every corner of my apartment. We hid them in smoke detectors, books, and even a teddy bear I had kept from my childhood. That night, I stayed at a hotel while Caius monitored the live feed. At 2 a.m., the screen showed two figures in dark hoodies picking the lock on my front door. I recognized the taller one instantly. It was Beckett, Torrin's best friend and workout partner. I watched as they moved through my living room, pulling small bags of white powder from their pockets and hiding them behind my sofa and inside my cereal boxes. They were laughing and taking selfies in my kitchen like it was a game. They had no idea that every second of their crime was being recorded in high definition and uploaded to a secure cloud server. They thought they were finishing me off, but they were actually handing me the rope to hang them with. I didn't call the police immediately. After they left, I went back to the apartment with Bram. We carefully removed all the illegal substances and replaced them with small bags filled with powdered sugar. I left a small, handwritten note inside one of the bags. "Nice try, brother. See you at the hospital." I knew that when the anonymous tip was called in the next morning, the police would find nothing but baking supplies, and I would have the video to prove who put them there. The next morning was the day of the scheduled surgery. My father had invited the news cameras to the hospital lobby, wanting to capture the heroic moment where his daughter finally saw the light and agreed to save him. He was sitting in a wheelchair, looking frail and sad for the cameras, while Delphine wiped away fake tears. I walked through the sliding doors, and the reporters swarmed me, asking if I was ready to be a hero. I walked straight up to Osric, who was smiling at the cameras. "Waverly, my dear," he said loudly, "thank you for doing the right thing." I didn't smile back. I pulled out my phone and connected it to the large monitor in the lobby that usually showed hospital information. "I'm not here to sign anything, Osric," I said, my voice echoing through the room. "I'm here to show the world the real Sterling family." I hit play. The audio of Torrin's voice filled the lobby, the recording I made where he said my life was worth less than his abs and that I was just an organ farm. Then I showed the video of Beckett planting the drugs in my apartment. The reporters went silent, their cameras now focused on my father's horrified face. "I'm not a hero," I told the crowd. "I'm a survivor of a family that treats people like property, and my answer is still no." The public scandal was massive. Osric's stock price began to plummet as investors saw the video of the frame-up. But then, a few hours later, the hospital released a statement. Osric had suffered a catastrophic relapse. The doctors said he had only 48 hours to live unless the transplant happened immediately. The pressure became suffocating once again. People on social media started saying that even if he was a jerk, I shouldn't let him die. Even my favorite nurse, Eulalie, begged me to be the bigger person. I felt a moment of doubt. Was I really going to let a man die? But then I remembered the journals. I remembered the powdered sugar. I went back to the hospital in disguise and found the room where the crooked doctor, Pascal, was preparing Osric's charts. I hid in the closet and watched as Pascal handed Delphine a small vial. "This will keep his blood pressure low enough to look like a crisis," Pascal whispered. "But we have to move fast. If we don't get her in the chair by tonight, the board will start asking for a second opinion." The relapse was faked. They were using medication to make Osric look like he was dying to guilt me into the surgery. They were playing with his actual life just to trick me. I recorded their conversation on my phone, feeling a cold sense of clarity. Every time I thought they couldn't go lower, they dug a new hole. I realized then that there was no bigger person in this room. There was only a predator and its prey. I turned and walked out, my heart finally turning to stone. I decided to disappear. I knew that if I stayed in the city, they would find a way to grab me. I turned off my phone, took out the battery, and left it in a trash can at the bus station. I took a taxi to a remote cabin in the woods that belonged to my mother's oldest friend, Winslow. She was a woman who had been excommunicated from the Sterling Circle years ago for trying to help my mother. She welcomed me with open arms and a loaded shotgun. "You're safe here, honey," she said. Back in the city, my family went into a total frenzy. They used their media connections to put a $500,000 bounty on my location. They told the public I had been kidnapped by a radical group and that my life was in danger. They were using the police and the public to hunt me down like an animal. I watched the news on Winslow's old TV, seeing my own face everywhere. I felt like a fugitive for the crime of wanting to keep my own body. Winslow sat with me, looking at the screen with a grim smile. "They're desperate, Waverly. That means you're winning." She handed me a laptop that was connected to a satellite network. "It's time to stop running and start hitting back. You have the journals, you have the videos, and you have the DNA results. Don't just hide. Destroy them." I realized she was right. I wasn't just a girl in the woods anymore. I was a whistleblower with enough evidence to burn the Sterling Empire to the ground. While I was in hiding, I decided to leak the biggest secret of all. I sent the DNA results and the medical files Eamon had found to a major financial news network. I showed the world that the Sterling heir, Torin, was also sick with the same rare genetic failure. The news hit the market like a tidal wave. Vanguard, the family's main company, lost $3 billion in value in 1 hour. Their healthy, vibrant heir was a lie, and the company's future was a question mark. Torin went into a complete meltdown. He called my old phone number hundreds of times, leaving screaming voicemails that I listened to via the cloud. But then his tone changed. He sent an email crying and begging. "Waverly, please," he wrote. "Forget Dad. I'm the one who really needs it. I'm scared. I don't want to die. I'll give you everything. I'll confess to the frame-up. Just come back and save me. You're my only hope." I sat in the quiet cabin, reading his words. He wasn't asking for my father anymore. He was asking for himself. He was the same boy who had mocked me and tried to put me in prison, and now he was groveling for my lifeblood. I felt a flicker of sadness for the brother I could have had, but I knew the truth. If the roles were reversed, he wouldn't even have given me a glass of water. I didn't reply. I just forwarded his confession of the frame-up to Caius and the police. The next day was my 25th birthday. According to my mother's will, this was the day her final trust would unlock. I had always thought it was just a small amount of money she had saved from her teaching days. I sat at Winslow's kitchen table and logged into the legal portal my mother had set up. My breath caught in my throat as the account balance appeared on the screen. It wasn't a few $1,000s. It was a hidden bank account containing 15% of Osric's total company shares. The trust included a letter from my mother's lawyer. She had received these shares as part of a secret pre-marriage settlement that Osric had signed when he was still a nobody, trying to impress her wealthy family. He had completely forgotten it existed, or he thought he had successfully buried it. Because of the recent stock crash, I was now the single largest individual shareholder in the Sterling Empire. I wasn't just the mistake child anymore. I was the person who owned the company. I looked at Winslow and showed her the screen. "I have enough shares to call an emergency board meeting," I said, my voice trembling with excitement. "I can walk into that mansion not as a victim, but as the boss." Winslow poured me a glass of cider and smiled. "Happy birthday, Waverly. I think it's time you went home and opened your presents." I felt a surge of power I had never known. The spare part was about to become the queen. I returned to the Sterling mansion on the afternoon of my birthday. I didn't sneak in through the back door. I drove a black car right up to the front steps and walked through the main entrance. The house was quiet, filled with the scent of lilies. I walked into the grand ballroom and found the entire family gathered. They were dressed in black, holding a mourning ceremony for their lost daughter, telling a group of reporters how much they missed me and how they prayed for my safe return. Delphine was mid-sob when she saw me standing in the doorway. She froze, her fake tears drying instantly. "Waverly, you're alive," she stammered. Osric, sitting in his wheelchair, looked at me with a mixture of terror and hope. "You came back, you're going to save us," he shouted. The reporters turned their cameras on me, the prodigal daughter who had returned at the final hour. They expected a tearful reunion. I walked to the center of the room and looked at the crowd. "I'm not here to save anyone," I said, my voice cold and clear. "And I'm not here for a funeral. I'm here to take my seat on the board. As of 10 minutes ago, I have officially registered my 15% stake in Sterling Global, and as the majority shareholder, I'm calling this meeting to order." The silence that followed was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. The morning ceremony was over. My reign had begun. I didn't waste any time. I had arranged for the two most influential board members, Corin and Rafferty, to be present. They were men who had been looking for a way to get rid of Osric's corruption for years. I stood at the head of the room and opened my laptop. I didn't show them financial charts. I showed them the video of Dr. Pascal admitting the medical crisis was faked. I showed them the footage of the drug plant. I showed them the journals detailing 30 years of embezzlement. Osric Sterling has used this company as his personal playground, I told the board. He has committed fraud, attempted frame-ups, and put the company's stability at risk to hide his own family's medical secrets. He is no longer fit to lead. Corin and Rafferty looked at the evidence with looks of pure disgust. They looked at Osric, who was sputtering and trying to claim I was lying. But the evidence was undeniable. The board didn't even need a full discussion. Rafferty stood up and looked at Osric. In accordance with the company bylaws regarding moral turpitude and criminal conduct, I move to remove Osric Sterling as CEO and chairman, effective immediately. All his voting rights are suspended pending a criminal investigation. Corin seconded the motion. In a matter of seconds, my father was stripped of the only thing he actually loved. He wasn't the king anymore. He was just a sick man in a wheelchair with no power left to hurt me. As the board members were leaving, Silas tried to make one last desperate move. He stepped forward with a stack of papers, his face twisted in a sneer. "This is irrelevant," he shouted. "We are still suing Waverly for intentional affliction of emotional distress. Her refusal to donate has caused irreparable harm to my client. We will tie her up in court for the next 10 years. He thought he could still use the law to bully me into a corner. But he didn't count on my new legal team. I signaled to the door, and my new lawyer, Sarin, walked in. Sarin was the most feared prosecutor in the state, and he had been waiting for this moment. He handed Silas a folder. "Actually, Silas, we're the ones filing charges. We have the high-definition footage of your client's associates planting drugs in my client's home. We have the evidence of your participation in the forgery of the will. You're not a lawyer anymore. You're an unindicted co-conspirator." Silas's face went pale. He looked at the folder, then at the police officers who were already entering the ballroom. He realized then that he had hitched his wagon to a falling star. He was handcuffed and led out of the mansion along with Delphine, who was being charged with fraud and attempted kidnapping. The legal hammer had finally fallen, and it was crushing everyone who had tried to crush me. I stood in the middle of the empty ballroom, finally feeling the weight of the Sterling name lift off my shoulders. A week later, I visited Osric in the hospital. He was no longer in the luxury suite. He was in a standard room hooked up to a state-funded dialysis machine. He looked truly gray now, the fake medication having worn off to reveal his actual failing health. He looked at me with hollow eyes, no longer shouting or sneering. He was a man who knew he was at the end of his road. "Waverly," he whispered, "please, I'll give you the mansion, I'll give you everything, just one kidney. I want to live." I looked at him, and for the first time I didn't feel anything. No anger, no sadness, just a strange sense of closure. "I don't need you to give me the mansion, Osric," I said calmly. I pulled out a document from the bank. "I already bought the mortgage from the bank 3 days ago when the company's stock crashed. You've been living in my house for a month. And as for the kidney, the answer is still no. Not because I'm cruel, but because I've finally learned that my life has value, even if you never saw it." I leaned in closer, my voice a quiet promise. "You wanted to use me as a spare part, but you ended up becoming the broken piece. You destroyed this family with your greed, and now you have to live with the silence you created." I turned and walked out of the room, leaving him alone with the rhythmic hum of the machine. I wasn't the mistake child anymore. I was the one who had finally said no to the monster, and in doing so, I had finally become free. I decided it was time to tell my story on my own terms. I did a sit-down interview with a famous journalist named Lark. We sat in the library of the mansion, and I told the world everything. I told them about the invisible childhood, the recordings, the frame-up, and the faked medical crisis. I told them what it was like to be treated as a spare part for 20 years. I didn't cry. I spoke with a calm, steady strength that seemed to captivate the entire country. The interview went viral. Within hours, the #saidno was trending globally. But something unexpected happened. Thousands of other black sheep, children, and mistake siblings began sharing their own stories of emotional abuse and being treated as secondary to the true heirs. People who had been told they were nothing were finding their voices through my story. I realized then that my no wasn't just for me. It was a no for everyone who had ever been made to feel expendable. The Sterling name, which used to stand for power and wealth, now stood for something else. the courage to walk away. I received letters from all over the world from people thanking me for showing them that they didn't owe their bodies or their souls to people who didn't love them. I realized that my mother's journals were right. The truth is the only thing that can truly set you free. I was no longer a ghost in a mansion. I was a beacon for people who were tired of living in the dark. The fallout for Torin was the most satisfying of all. Without his father's protection and the company's money, his influencer lifestyle evaporated overnight. He was dropped by every single one of his sponsors, including the luxury watch brand. They didn't want their face to be a man who had tried to frame his sister for a crime. He was left with nothing but his debts and his failing health. In a final, desperate act, he tried to sell my mother's vintage jewelry collection to pay for a private clinic. He took the pieces to a high-end jeweler, but when they ran the appraisal, the man let out a short, mocking laugh. "These are high-quality fakes, Mr. Sterling," the jeweler said. "The gold is plated and the stones are glass. They're worth about $50 each." Torin was horrified. He didn't realize that I had anticipated his greed years ago. When I was 18, and I saw the way he looked at my mother's things, I had swapped the real pieces for high-end replicas and hidden the originals in Winslow's cabin. Torin was left standing in the jewelry store, holding a box of worthless glass. He had tried to steal my mother's memory, but he had ended up with a handful of junk. He was eventually forced to move into a small apartment and start the same dialysis treatments as our father. He finally had the surgical scar he was so afraid of, but it wasn't from a donation. It was from the reality of his own choices. The Golden Sun was now just a cautionary tale of what happens when you value your image over your humanity. I decided to use my mother's recovered funds and my company's shares for something meaningful. I opened the Second Chance Clinic, a state-of-the-art facility dedicated to people who actually need transplants but can't afford the medical bills or the legal fees. We created a transparent, ethical system where money couldn't buy you a place at the front of the line. I wanted to make sure that no one else was ever pressured or bullied into a surgery they didn't want. I hired Dr. Alaric as the head of surgery. He was the only person in that entire hospital who had tried to tell me the truth, and I wanted him to lead a team of people who valued integrity above all else. We also started a legal aid department to help black sheep children reclaim their inheritances and protect themselves from family abuse. The clinic became a sanctuary for people who had been treated as expendable, and watching the first successful, voluntary transplant filled me with a joy I can't describe. I also established a scholarship fund in my mother's name, specifically for students who had their funding pulled by foundation priorities. I wanted to make sure that no one's education was ever used as a weapon again. I stood at the grand opening of the clinic, looking at the sign that bore my mother's maiden name. I wasn't a Sterling anymore. I was a Winslow. I had taken the ruins of a billionaire's empire and built a foundation of hope. My mother's legacy was finally being honored in the way it deserved. I visited Osric one last time. He was hooked up to a final round of machines, his eyes unfocused and his voice gone. He looked at me and I saw a flicker of the man who had once ruled the city, but it was fading fast. He tried to reach for my hand, but I stayed back. He managed to whisper one last question. "Are you happy, now that you've destroyed the family?" He still didn't understand. He still thought that I was the one who had brought the house down. I looked him right in the eye, my voice calm and steady. "I didn't destroy this family, Osric. You did. You destroyed it the day you lied to my mother. You destroyed it the day you put me in the servant's wing. You destroyed it the day you tried to frame me for a crime I didn't commit. I didn't break the family. I just stopped pretending to be part of the wreckage." I reached into my bag and pulled out the get well card I had brought to him on the very first day. It was still unopened. I placed the card on his bedside table and walked out of the room. I walked through the hospital doors and into the bright, warm sunshine. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like a mistake or a ghost. I felt like a woman who was whole and free. I got into my car and drove toward the clinic, ready to start a life that belonged only to me. The mistake child had finally found her place in the world, and it was a place where no was the most powerful word of all.